What if I told you that the idea of original sin, the idea that Eve and Adam did something dramatically wrong towards God and got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, was not actually about Adam and Eve, but about this God? What if the first sin was God's original sin, and that sin was a series of events that started when men came from the northeast and the southeast, brutally taking the sword to these tribes that were found there, separating mother-child, erasing mothers from the center of these societies? And what if this little lie that was hidden in history for 6,000 years is actually why you feel so broken, why you feel so sinful, why you feel like you are always to blame for things going wrong in your life and for your separation from God? Hi, I'm Holly. Welcome to Deconstructing Patriarchy, where we are making the invisible structure and foundation of patriarchy visible so that we can stop blaming ourselves for what are systemic problems that are woven into every single facet of our lives. This allows us to actually do the work to stop trying to create equality in a system that was never meant to be equal, and instead put our energy into making systems that actually will serve us and that are truly meant to be equitable from the very get-go, from its foundation. Here's the thing I want you to always remember. When you feel broken, when you feel sinful, when you feel like you're separated from God, it's not you. It's the system, and it's the system functioning as it's meant to be. Today, we are going to do something that might feel a little prickly if you're just coming out of the church, or you're still in the church, or maybe you just really believe in the idea of original sin. We're going to peel back the patriarchal layers that we are taught to see the world through and see a completely different version when we look back at history through this other lens. We're going to see how patriarchy actually invented original sin and then blamed us for it. By the end of this video, you are never going to read the story of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man the same again. And probably not your Bible either. A few weeks ago, on what would have been my mother's 78th birthday, I sat by a river crying. I lost her when I was 9 years old, just shy of 10, and I always just thought it was a personal tragedy. But then, after a year of doing this work myself, deconstructing patriarchy, not just putting the videos together for you all, but also doing this work on myself, I started to read a book by Renee Eisler called The Chalice and the Blade. As I read this book, everything in my life started to click yet again, but in even more clarity than it had previously. Now, I have worked with the Garden of Eden and the fall of man story repeatedly over the last 10 to 15 years, trying to make sense of it. But Renee's take on what might have happened back then was just completely jaw-dropping, eye-opening, and has made more sense than any of the other theories that I've worked through. And what I was seeing about losing my mother and then being severed from her family wasn't just personal, it was actually collective. And it started 6,000 years ago when patriarchy came onto the scene from Northern and Southern Eastern Europe into the main parts of Europe. Today, I'm going to show you 3 of those themes that hit me as I was reading this book about original sin that will change everything for the better, I promise. So stick with me. Number 1, here's what they don't teach you in Sunday school or history class. For tens of thousands of years before patriarchy began, just 6,000 years ago, humanity lived in different structural societies other than patriarchy, other than this hierarchy of men on top of females or other men. Some of these other societies that we have been able to find archaeological evidence for were centered around the mother-child relationship. So instead of the foundation being patriarchy and the control of the womb, as I talk about in episode 1 of season 1, instead it was the foundation being the mother-child relationship. Now think about that for a moment. This makes perfect sense to structure a society around what people obviously could see way before science came on the scene. People understood that women got pregnant. Maybe they didn't know at first how that happened, but women got pregnant and a baby came out of them. The mother was connected to the child was connected to the mother. This was observable and undeniable truth with a capital T. So ancients, doing what people do, honored what they saw in front of them. They made it sacred. They made the mother-child relationship sacred, and they worshiped the figure of the mother and the creator of all of life, Earth. This is where goddess worship really began. was in the honoring of the creation of life, of being able to produce life from one's body. And here's another kicker when you start to study these societies. They weren't savage, primitive cultures that we've been taught. Archaeological evidence proves that they were actually super peaceful, that they had a flatter society that didn't have the classes and hierarchy, that they were more egalitarian, and that they were super creative in their life-giving art and even in their technology. Some of these societies that we've found the evidence for also had advanced city planning and running indoor plumbing. But here's the biggest thing I want you to focus on for this point. These societies created life, and they had no need to destroy it. They weren't in competition with each other or with other tribes around them. So they didn't have to waste their energy producing weapons of warfare and fortresses because there wasn't that threat. If you want to know more about these societies, such as Minoan Crete and perhaps it being the Atlantis, drop yes below and I'll put that episode together for us. Back to our topic today and that idea that these societies created life instead of death. They didn't destroy life, they created it. These societies had values such as love thy neighbor, take care of your children, honor the bond between mother and child. Does that sound familiar to any prophet that came along, say about 2,000 years ago that we celebrate during a certain time of year called Christmas? Anywho, that would be getting ahead of ourselves. So let's go back to 6,000 years ago when everything began to change. What actually was happening, from what we can tell, is groups from the Northeast and the Southeast, i.e. from the Red Sea area, hint, hint, came in and swept over old Europe, which were filled with these partnership, egalitarian, peaceful communities. They had the sword, the blade, and they brutally murdered these people. And they were dominated by something that the peaceful, egalitarian partnership societies had never seen before: egotistical domination. The idea that some humans were better than others and therefore should rule over the rest. But they had a problem in taking over these communities. The idea that the mother-child relationship was so central and in our bones was really hard to replace. So when they couldn't wipe out by the sword all of these people, they did something really radical and perverse. They actually rewrote the sacred stories to start telling a different story that we know of all too well in this day and age. Our first key takeaway in understanding original sin and where it came from is this: that the Garden of Eden was actually these old European mother-child-centric societies. It was a real time and place, not some mythical concept made up for a story that we should all long for, the Garden of Eden. The other point to remember here is that there is archaeological evidence, not just in the ground, but in the Bible, in the creation story. Point number 2, and this is where it gets really wild and perverse. As I mentioned before, in number 1, patriarchy attempted to kill off most of these populations by the sword. Think about the Old Testament commandments where the Jews were commanded by God to wipe out entire nations that supposedly God created. They weren't supposed to leave anyone behind lest they be influenced by them. But the mother-child relationships were so widespread throughout old Europe that the blade couldn't take care of all of these societies. So they did it in a different way, by using the oral tradition and eventually the written word. They patriarchy realized that they needed to convince the people that the mother-child relationship was not central to all of life, that it was not the natural order of life, and so they wrote it into their stories. They remythicized their stories with a perversion of the truth. These stories look nothing like the original stories, the natural life stories that we can see happening before our very eyes even today. And instead, they started to say that that was a perversion, that those were barbarian stories, that those were primitive people, that they didn't understand the true nature of the divine. In ancient Greece, for example, there was a story written, and please forgive me if I get this wrong, called Orestia. I believe that's correct. In this play, a son murders his mom, and when he is on trial for this murder, Apollo pipes in and says this: "The mother is no parent of that which is called her child. She is only a nurse of the seed that grows. I will show you proof there can be a father without any mother. There stands Athena, daughter of Zeus, who was never in the dark of any womb. I mean, WTF? They literally wrote in this perversion of the truth, of the true natural order, into their culture through these stories that mother and child did not belong together, that mothers weren't true parents, that children came from fathers, and that wombs were just, oh, those are just containers. Those are just seed planting containers. In the play, this evidence actually allowed Oreste, again, I apologize if I get that wrong, to get off scot-free for murdering a woman who happened to be his mother. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, they were writing a different version of this same story. The Garden of Eden, the birth of woman through the man's rib, and the fall of humanity, really of women. So let's break the story of Eden down bit by bit, knowing what we now know about there being a true Garden of Eden and what actually happened in that Garden of Eden, literally. As we've already seen and can still see in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, the blade couldn't wipe out all of these communities. They still kept popping up throughout all of Europe and through time. Too many people, especially women, wanted to continue to worship what was actually natural order, not the perversion of truth. So they had to get creative. They started to retell these old stories or remythicize these old goddess figures into something completely unrepresented earlier in these stories. One such goddess was Lilith. She shows up a lot in different cultures across old Europe and Mesopotamia before patriarchy. And then she has different representations within patriarchy, one of them being in the story of Inanna, which is super fascinating when you look at that story. If you want to know more about that story, also drop a yes, Inanna, in the comments, and we'll dive into that one as well. But here's the version of Lilith that we need to focus on to make sense of our story. As patriarchy rewrote the story in the area of Canaan, Lilith, who represented the goddess of sexuality, of fertility, of fierce independence and liberation, became this first wife of Adam, who wouldn't submit to him by laying on her back during intercourse. What did the patriarchy do? It penalized her by casting her out of the Garden of Eden, i.e. these partnership societies, and turning her into this she-demon in the middle of the desert who had this insatiable hunger for men and their night emissions, and birthed thousands of demons on the population of Canaan. This is one of the first examples where we can find the sexuality of women start to be repressed and separated from the mother figure and her fertility. Oh my gosh. If you want more about that story, drop a yes, Lilith, in the comments, and we can also get into that story. Anywho, this taught women who once revered Lilith as the fertility goddess that she was to fear her and distance themselves from her. Eventually, this prequel to the Garden of Eden, Eve, got quietly forgotten and erased over the centuries. In place of Lilith, patriarchy invented Eve, born of a man, not of a woman, because that's truly how creation happens. And this way, they could control Eve to do what they wanted her to do. But there's something interesting here when you look at it through this lens that I'm teaching you to look at it through. Eve still reaches for the tree of knowledge. And what did trees represent to people back then? They represented the goddess, the fertility of the earth and of women. They represented creation from the mother. Everyone hearing this story would have known exactly what this meant. Eve is reaching for this ancient wisdom in the goddess-centered cultures. She's yearning to go home to her mother-child relationship. She reaches for this tree, for the fruit of knowledge of good and evil that she would have known coming out of the Garden of Eden, out of these partnership societies. She attempts to hand it to Adam to share it with him. And then God comes down from his mighty high place or wherever he's at, i.e. coming in from these other tribes, and says, what the F are you doing? You don't go back to the mother. You're not allowed to worship the mother. You're not allowed to connect to the mother. The mother is nothing. I birthed you. You came from the man. How dare you? You are to blame for trying to reach to this garden. Patriarchy had to create a way to shame people out of trying to connect to the innate truth that's in our bone and in our marrow, in our souls, that patriarchy has never been able to separate us from. But it did. It tried to do this, right? Through the story of the Garden of Eden. It had to shame us out of trying to connect to the true goddess, the true God, the mother of creation. And then it kicked us out of the Garden of Eden, blaming us for its sin of what it originally did. So do you see truly what happened there in the Garden of Eden and the fall of man in the Bible that we know of? These societies were goddess-centric, life-giving, life-worshiping societies. God didn't like that because it displaced him and his ego and his domination and his ability to subjugate everybody else. So they created a story where they could shame us for trying to connect with that truth and then blamed us for that action. But it was patriarchy's action that severed us from the goddess. And it perverts this truth in order to make us believe that we originally separated ourselves from God by trying to reach for the true God, the mother. That was God's idea of what original sin really was. To him, of course, right? He doesn't want you to worship God the mother. He wants to be the mother, essentially. He wants to be the one that birthed you and has every right to be over you and to be zealous for your love. Here's our second takeaway in the idea of patriarchy's original sin. The fall, it wasn't about you. It wasn't your fault. It was God's. It was patriarchy's, creating this male God and then blaming us for its actions. The God-shaped vacuum in our souls, that's for mother God, not for father God, for mother the tree, for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's what mother, the creator of life, gives each of us innately from birth. Patriarchy took what was natural and perverted it into what was unnatural and then called the perversion the truth and the natural the perversion. It made what was holy, the mother-child relationship, perverse. Patriarchy created original sin by its actions, by sweeping in and ripping us away from the mother-child relationship, and then blamed us for that original sin. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Adam? Oh, Adam. Why are you always blaming the woman? The fall and sin were never about you. They were never your fault. They were always about God and patriarchy and what patriarchy did to humanity, and then tried to smoke and mirror us out of believing that they did this action. Before we get on to our third point, I want to take a moment and hear from our sponsors. You. Yes, you. When I began this channel as Deconstructing Patriarchy, I really wanted to get monetized and make patriarchy pay to deconstruct itself. That has proven not to be so successful. And as I learn more about how that monetization channel idea works, it's going to take a lot longer. I will need to get to probably 100,000 or above to actually make some decent money on this. Instead of going out and getting sponsors that might not align with, well, I wouldn't take them if they didn't align, but I don't want to push people's products and ideas and thoughts. I really want to keep this much more community-based, much more educational-based. I'm giving you the opportunity to sponsor this work through Substack. There's Deconstructing Patriarchy and The Sacred Tryst. If you want to know more about either of those and what you get as a sponsor, besides the idea of you're helping yourself and future generations have a better future history, please go to the links below and see if this resonates for you. If not, just continue to show up, watch these videos, share them with people. We need a wide berth of people hearing this information. We need it to be the new good news in order for us to start to turn the tide on what patriarchy has done. Back to our message for today. This is where it starts to get personal, not just for me, but for you hopefully as well. I'm going to start with my personal story, and that's going to flow us right into how we can apply this to us collectively today. So when I lost my mother at 9, my mother's family, who was really my only family, decided not to keep me. Instead, they decided to send me and my brother off to a father who lived maybe more than 1,000 miles away from my hometown and my community and the people I knew, to a community I had no idea who was there. I had no connection to. I had no connection to this father. But because these beliefs that the father is the father and he should take responsibility because that's what patriarchy tells us fathers are meant to do, my family adhered to that and sent us off to this man who had never showed up to be a parent in my life. And guess what? 6 months later, he called some of my other family and said, I don't want them. Take them back or I send them to an orphanage. So my family scrambled, and instead of taking me and my brother back in, they decided to displace us yet again with a strange family. Now, as you can imagine, that gives a child a lot of trauma. I lost my mother, I lost my mother's family, I was sent off to a man I didn't know, and then sent off to a family I didn't know, and that family turned out to be pretty abusive and alcoholic. So I hit my first college year, pretty traumatized, and shit started to hit the fan at that first Thanksgiving break. So I desperately called up one of my mother's sisters and I said, I can't do this. My life feels like it's falling apart. I need a safe place to land and recollect myself. Now, here's the thing that I didn't realize back then, but of course I realize it now, is that unconsciously, she reminded me the most of my mother. My mother had a couple sisters, and this one reminded me the most. And she'd also done something that had trauma bonded me to her, which of course I didn't know that until recently. And so I was reaching out because I really wanted to connect to my mother, to that mother hole-shaped vacuum in my soul. So I pursued going to her for that reason. Now, when I got down there a couple weeks or a couple of months later, that's not exactly what happened. She instead took me to him. Well, she actually kind of demanded after the fact that if I was going to live with them for free, which I appreciate, I could go to any church, but of course I wanted to go with people I knew, so I went with them to church. And lo and behold, 5 months later, I ended up giving my life to Jesus. I ended up becoming a daughter of God and having God the Father in my life for the next 16 years, pursuing that relationship as if it would heal the vacuum of losing my mother, of being severed from my mother, not once, not twice, 3 times through my family and the way that they handled situations. I thought that father relationship would heal that, but it didn't. I tried for 16 years, but it so did not fill that vacuum of being severed from my mother at such a young age. And now this is where it gets collective. So many of us are set up to do this exact thing because of patriarchy remythicizing these ancient cultural stories around the mother into the father that we looked at in point 1 and 2. We feel broken. We feel like something's missing. We feel separated from God, from ourselves, from each other. We feel like sinners. So we rush to churches, to mosques, to temples, to meditation, and we bow to male figures, to the father, to male-centric gods, thinking that it's gonna fill this original sin that God created in us. But we can't. We can't fill that mother God-shaped hole in our soul that God created in us by going to God, because he's the one that separated us from our mother, from Goddess the Mother in the first place. He's not the one we're separated from. He did the separation and then convinced us that this separation from the God, which was really God the Mother, was our fucking fault. Our third takeaway from this idea of God and his original sin is this. If we want to truly find our place on the earth, if we want to truly feel like we belong, we have to return to Mother Earth. We have to return to our connection to the earth, which is through our mother line, through the womb that we came out of. I'm not necessarily talking about the relationship with your mother. I know a lot of us have damaged relationships with our mother, and it probably is a lot of it because of this issue. But we can always return to the mother goddess, the mother of us all, the earth. And I'm not saying we're gonna get pagan. It doesn't have to be that if that doesn't feel right for you. But we can start looking at the divine feminine and understanding that that relationship is what feels broken in us, because that's what was broken in us with God's original sin. Of course, none of this is going to happen overnight. It's 6,000 years of history written in such a way to make us believe that we are to blame for our sins, for the destruction of the earth, for the broken relationships, for the violence, for the brutality, for the hunger, for everything. We've been blamed for that, but it's patriarchy's sin. And we need to start seeing that, naming it, and claiming it, sisters and brothers, with everything we have. And we need to tell each other, it's not your fault. You're not to blame. You are not broken. It is the system that is to blame. It is the system's sin. And we can get out of this. We can start seeing the lie for what it is. Original sin is not your inheritance. It's patriarchy's crime blamed on you. If you want to go deeper and get some prompts to help you with this, join me on my Deconstructing Patriarchy Substack, where I'll have an option for sponsors to go deeper with this material. For now, drop a comment and let me know, where do you see this myth playing out in your life? It's not going to show up exactly the same as it did in mine, but where have you felt the severance from God the Mother, not God the Father? And what have you tried to stuff into that hole created by patriarchy severing us from the mother? If you want more on this topic, again, go to my Substack. I'll have the links below where I write more about this exact topic. And if you want more than I'm sharing in either of those two places, drop me a comment and let me know. If you want to go further with this concept and this idea, then watch this video here where I ask the question, did Jesus actually preach goddess values?